Since the early days of Breath of the Wild, there's been a prominent theory making its rounds within the Zelda community. One that, if true, could have some pretty massive lore implications. The idea is that the Kingdom of Hyrule we explore in Breath of the Wild, and by extent its sequel, Tears of the Kingdom, was once at the bottom of a great ocean, reminiscent of the myth of Atlantis. The evidence for this? Salt. But not that kind of salt. Rather, the kind you would season a good meal with. The item description for one of the game's materials, rock salt, states that these minerals are leftovers from an ancient sea. And since these crystals can be found in practically every corner of Hyrule, including high up in the mountains, it makes sense to assume that the kingdom was indeed flooded at some point in history, either partially or in its entirety. Of course, for the astute Zelda lore enthusiast, especially those who are invested in the timeline to some degree, the possibility of an ancient flood naturally calls back to the Wind Waker, the only time in history that the kingdom was lost beneath the waves of a Great Sea, at least the only instance that we know of anyway. It's an easy connection to make, and as expected, it's often been used as a vital clue to support a timeline placement for the Switch titles. Either that the games follow the adult timeline directly, or that the timelines merged somehow, and the events from the previous games all happened, including the Wind Waker's Great Flood. Now, for the longest time, the rock salt item description was the only concrete piece of evidence for Hyrule's ancient flood myth, albeit a convincing one. There was some supporting evidence, like the fact that we found giant whale fossils on the surface, but that on its own wasn't enough to conclude that the entire continent was essentially a seafloor at one point. After all, much like the ancient dragons, whales in the Zelda universe often fulfill the role of a deity, and have been known to possess the power of flight, like Levius and the Windfish. In other words, they could have simply crash-landed into Hyrule, or may have lived among the surface dwellers similar to Lord Jabu Jabu, inside a lake or an artificial basin of sorts. That being said, with the release of Tears of the Kingdom, Masterworks, and now the new voice memories found in the Switch 2 versions, the evidence that Hyrule used to be underwater has piled up significantly, to the extent that a great flood is all but confirmed. The voice memories in particular mention some pretty interesting stuff related to this topic. For starters, there's a memory from Princess Zelda, who comments on the Gerudo Great Skeleton. So let's take a listen to what she has to say.
The immense Gerudo Great Skeleton lies here. Legends say that long, long ago, Hyrule was actually the bottom of a vast ocean. Considering the marine fossils that have been found across the world, I see little reason to doubt this. Except, it seems to me that there are too few fossils. Maybe sea life found roots even deeper. Maybe through chasms like the one near Barida Lookout. Maybe as far as the depths. No, I'm getting carried away.
I think the memory kinda speaks for itself. According to legend, the Hyrule we see here was once a seafloor, and the part where she says that the amount of fossils are too few seems to be a nod to the other great skeletons we found inside the depths. I guess the idea is that as the waters receded and Hyrule became a landmass, some of the marine life migrated to the depths, as Zelda states, possibly through the chasms, which would have been underwater tunnels at the time. As such, these could be the remains of sea creatures who managed to escape the changing water levels above, prolonging their existence until, eventually, the depths also dried up. Now, to be fair, Zelda is speculating here and not stating facts, but it's worth bringing up that there's another voice memory, this time from Master Koga, that seems to corroborate the idea that the giant skeletons down here originated from the surface.
Wow! I've seen some big skeletons in Gerudo Desert, but I don't think I've run into anything like that down here. If the surface and the depths are connected, then that means the creatures living up above could come down here. I think.
If we are to assume for a moment that Zelda and Koga's speculations are correct, then it would definitely explain some other findings as well. Things that, when viewed in isolation, don't mean much, but become more relevant when a giant, all-encompassing flood is taken into consideration. For example, the existence of sand seals, which could have evolved from regular seals who lived back when the desert was still covered in ocean. A possibility Zelda also contemplates in one of her voice memories.
The sand seals, which I understand to have evolved from an aquatic creature of some kind, reside only in Gerudo and move through the desert as if swimming. The Gerudo use them as a means of transportation. However, they are quite difficult to handle. Without Urbosa's training, I might never have been able to maneuver one.
Furthermore, it could also explain the frogs, the only inhabitants that seem to be native to the depths. Well, the only ones that are still alive anyway. Their design and name is clearly inspired by real-life frogs, which are amphibians who spend most of their lives inside bodies of water. There's also the fact that some of the vegetation down here looks awfully similar to aquatic plant life, which makes sense if all of this used to be underwater. Lastly, and this is pure conjecture, but if the giant skeletons are indeed leftovers of ancient marine life, the same could also apply to many of the other massive fossils we find on the surface. Because yes, the whales and their counterparts in the depths are far from the only massive skeletons in Hyrule. There's a plethora of giant rib cages, skulls, and other huge body parts littered across the kingdom, and one can only imagine who or what these bones used to belong to. Speaking of which, one thing that stands out about the skeletons in the depths is that opposed to the ones on the surface, these fossils appear serpentine instead of whale-like. They don't seem to have had any appendages, like arms, legs, fins, or wings, which makes them unlike any other creature alive in the current age, like the dragons, who not only have limbs, but also horns, something that's also absent from the fossils, and you would expect to find traces of if they had them, like we saw on Stalord, for example. In fact, the only creature in the series I can think of that bears any resemblance to these skeletons are the sea snakes from Majora's Mask, also known as deep pythons. One could make the case for Morpheal as well, however Morpheal doesn't have eyes. Well, not on his face anyway. So based on the evidence so far, it seems likely that the surface and the underground were indeed submerged at one point. And so it would make sense that just like the whales, these skeletons once belonged to an aquatic life form, possibly sea snakes. Perhaps this is why these creatures in particular were able to make their way into the underground, whereas the whales did not. Their flexible and more narrow profile could have made it easier for them to venture through the narrow underwater passages. Basically, the whales were too fat, is what I'm trying to say. In short, I think it's fair to conclude that the legend Zelda speaks of is probably true. Which leaves us with one final question. Does any of this have something to do with the Wind Waker flood? Does it prove that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom take place in either the adult timeline, or as mentioned earlier, at the end of a timeline merger, or Dragon Break as some call it? The short answer is maybe, but not necessarily. And the long answer is, well, the remaining runtime of this video. Now don't get me wrong, a big part of me wants the Wind Waker connection to be true, if only because it would narrow down the timeline placement of the Switch titles to basically two options. But I have to take all the evidence into account, including aspects that work against the idea. For example, one of the strongest pieces of evidence, the rock salt, does have one little discrepancy, which is the fact that the mineral can also be found in Echoes of Wisdom, a game that factually cannot have taken place after Wind Waker, seeing as they exist in a completely separate timeline branch. And yet, here it is, rock salt in every corner of Hyrule. I know it's a little nitpicky since I wouldn't have been able to make this argument just a few months ago, and I highly doubt that the developers actually took lore implications into account when they added this item to the game. But it is here nonetheless, so I do think it's fair to take it into consideration. Which brings me to my next point. Just because this iteration of Hyrule was underwater at one point, as the evidence clearly shows, that doesn't mean that it has to be related to the Wind Waker. Hyrule is an incredibly old and volatile place, one that has gone through many changes over its long history. In one game it's a landlocked kingdom with no seas or oceans anywhere in sight, or it may border a sea on one or two sides. Next it's an island, or a set of islands. Climates keep changing, things, people, and even entire landmarks and cities move around. Heck, the kingdom itself even moved to an entirely different continent in the adult timeline. Who's to say that Breath of the Wild's Hyrule is even in the same geographical location at this point? It's clear that when it comes to sea levels in particular, there's always been significant changes between games, with or without the help of the gods. One of the best examples of this is found in Skyward Sword, which, as many of you know, takes place in two different time periods, and not like in Ocarina of Time where the difference between past and present is only 7 years. We're talking at least 1,000, possibly several thousands of years. The game doesn't show much of ancient Hyrule beyond the Temple of Hylia and the confined spaces created by the Time Shift Stones, so we don't have a complete picture of the landscape and what it may have looked like. But we do know that there are some major differences. The most obvious example is the Lanayru Desert and the bordering Sand Sea. The former used to be lush and green, as opposed to barren, and the latter was a vast ocean as far as the eyes can see. But that's not all. There's an additional lore secret which reveals a bit more about the ancient topography. The walls inside Skipper's house depict a map of Hyrule as it was back in his time, complete with shipping routes, the location of the two gates of time, and you can even make out the sealed grounds as seen on present-day maps. Now, unfortunately, it only shows the bottom half of the map. Still, we can clearly see that Hyrule's provinces used to be 3 disconnected islands separated by ocean, an ocean which has since receded or dried up completely. So yes, even though the Wind Waker is the only game where the kingdom was entirely submerged, save for the very top of the highest mountains, it is definitely not the only instance where the sea level changed quite drastically, and chances are we haven't even seen half of it. I mean, who knows what Hyrule looked like thousands of years before this? It might explain why crystallized rock salt can be found in Hyrule even in games that cannot possibly have taken place after Wind Waker. They could be the remains of a much older flood, perhaps one that dates all the way back to creation, who knows? Now, I don't want to get too scientific here since we are dealing with a fantasy world, but it's worth mentioning that rock salt takes millions of years to form, not thousands or even tens of thousands. In fact, studies suggest that our planet used to be one giant ocean, with little to no land masses above water. Thus, every continent we know today used to be submerged at one point in history, and this stage in the Earth's life is also known as the water world. As such, it's possible that Hyrule, or rather the planet it's located on, went through a similar phase, a time in which the ocean was all there was, and giant sea creatures dominated the world. The age of Leviathans, if you will, which could very well be the oldest sentient beings in the Zelda universe besides the gods. Of course, that does beg the question, if Hyrule used to be entirely covered by ocean, where did all the water go? Well, we can only guess. Some of it still persists in the underground, so it seems, mainly in the form of subterranean lakes and underground rivers. And obviously there are still seas, lakes and rivers on the surface as well. As for the rest of it, it could be a combination of many things. When it comes to real life, most of the water that once made up the primordial ocean is still present today. It's just that as the planet cooled and tectonic plates started to form, the distribution of the water changed. Some of it evaporated into the atmosphere or is now stored inside ice sheets, and a significant portion migrated into the Earth's crust and mantle through cracks and fissures. So maybe the ancient ocean that once covered Hyrule may have disappeared in a similar fashion. For instance, much of it could have seeped further down into the earth, like at the massive bottomless hole at Gloom's lair, for example. Or, you know, maybe the gods did it, who knows. I also want to quickly address the ancient map inside the Forgotten Temple. It shows the landscape of Hyrule as it was back in ancient times, and one thing that stands out about it is that there was a lot more water than in the present day. In particular, the massive lake in central Hyrule, which obviously isn't there anymore. Now, one could make the case that this is yet another indicator of a Wind Waker type flood, that perhaps the map was made in a time when the flood was more recent. But it's worth mentioning that in the shot where Zelda overlooks ancient Hyrule, this giant lake is nowhere to be found, and so it had to have formed after the events of the Imprisoning War, which is also when the map was allegedly created, at least according to Masterworks. There's actually a pretty good explanation for this map, and I highly recommend watching this video by Dreamshrine. She makes a strong argument that the lake in central Hyrule was the byproduct of a different kind of flood. Not the all-encompassing biblical type, but a smaller regional flood that originated from the Lanayru province. In fact, it's this flood that may have prompted the Zora and Hylians to build East Reservoir Lake, a project that was meant to contain the waters of Lanayru and prevent future catastrophes. As such, the ancient map is likely unrelated to the rock salt and the giant fossils. Now, if any of this is true, then it does contradict the idea that the depths are the old kingdom of Hyrule, the one that was lost at the end of the Wind Waker, which is a theory that's been proposed. In fact, here's a great video by Gossip Geist and Commonwealth Realm that explains the idea in great detail. Me personally, I suspect that the depths predate Wind Waker, and is a much older and integral part of this world, something that, as mentioned before, may have existed as far back as the world's formation. We know that something has existed deep below the surface since before Skyward Sword. Not only is it implied that Demise and his demon tribe originated from a place deep below the earth, but Echoes of Wisdom also makes the case that the earth has always contained large, hollow spaces, some reaching as far down as the planet's core even. We'll probably never know for sure when the depths were formed or how. I simply wanted to demonstrate that there is more than one option besides the Wind Waker flood. That the rock salt, the giant marine fossils, among other things, could originate from a time well before any Zelda game currently on the timeline. That isn't to say that I don't believe that a connection between these games exists. There may very well be, but like I said, the world of Hyrule is very old and dynamic, and I'm not quite at the point where I'm willing to connect the Switch titles to the older games based on the current evidence alone. But let me know what you think. Is this proof for the Wind Waker's Great Flood, or are you more on the skeptical side? Feel free to share your ideas in the comments. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, thank you to my Patreons and channel members, and have a great day.